I pushed open the front door and kicked off my shoes, savoring the familiar coolness of the hardwood floor beneath my aching feet. The day at the grocery store had been exhausting, selecting ingredients for the dinner I'd planned for David and Sarah. After 6 months of them living under my roof, I knew their preferences by heart, their routines, their schedules. Or at least I thought I did. When I stepped into the living room, Sarah stood there with her arms crossed, wearing that artificial smile I'd grown to despise over the months since they'd moved in. But something was different tonight. Her eyes gleamed with malice I'd either never noticed before or had deliberately ignored. "Olivia," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, the tone she always used when she wanted something. But now it carried a colder edge, more calculated than before. "We need to discuss something extremely important." I set the grocery bags on the coffee table, the same table I'd purchased 20 years ago with my first paycheck from cleaning offices. My hands trembled as I released them, not from their weight, but from the tension thick enough to slice through. David sat on my sofa, the same sofa where I comforted him through his first heartbreak at 16, where we'd watch Sunday afternoon movies when he was just a boy. Now he couldn't even meet my eyes, as if 30-odd years of unconditional love had been completely erased from his memory. "You see, ma'am," Sarah continued, walking toward me with deliberate, predatory steps. "David and I have been discussing this, and we've reached a conclusion. This arrangement, with you coming and going whenever you please, simply isn't working for us anymore. This house needs order, structure, respect." My legs trembled slightly, but I kept my spine straight. At 71 years old, I'd learned that sometimes dignity is the only thing a woman possesses, and I refused to surrender mine so easily. "Respect," I repeated, my voice steadier than I expected. "Respect in my own home." Sarah laughed, a hollow, rehearsed sound full of contempt that struck me like an invisible slap. "Your house?" she said, drawing out the words mockingly. "Look around, Olivia. Do you see yourself paying the electricity bills? Do you see yourself buying the groceries we eat every single day? Do you see yourself maintaining this household?" I looked around my living room, the room where I'd raised my 3 children. The walls were painted the soft yellow I'd chosen when David turned 10, because he said it reminded him of sunshine. The shelves displayed photographs of our family, David graduating from college, his wedding to Sarah, happy moments that now felt like framed lies. "David is the one maintaining everything now," Sarah continued, gesturing theatrically toward my son. "He pays the bills, buys the food, handles all the expenses. I think that gives him a right to establish some basic ground rules for cohabitation." My son finally spoke, though he kept his eyes fixed on his phone, as if the words leaving his mouth were as mundane as discussing the weather. "Mom, what Sarah means is we need to set boundaries. You can't just walk in unannounced like this. It's uncomfortable for us, especially when we're busy." The words landed in my stomach like stones of ice. Announce myself? To enter my own house? The house where I'd raise him, where I'd change his diapers, where I'd comfort him through nightmares. "Exactly," Sarah chimed in with a smile that froze my blood. "A text message, a phone call. It's not too much to ask, is it? After all, ma'am, you don't have permission or the right to enter without notice. This house operates under new rules now, and you better adapt to them." I stood frozen, feeling the world I'd built over decades crumbling beneath my feet. This was a house where I'd mourned my husband Mark's death, where I'd celebrated every one of my children's birthdays, where I preserved every drawing David made in kindergarten. Now they were demanding I ask permission to access my own memories. And if I refused to accept these rules, I asked, though from the satisfaction gleaming in Sarah's eyes, I already knew the answer. David finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes shattered me more completely than any cruel words could have. There was no love, no respect, not even nostalgia for everything we'd shared. Only impatience, as if I were a tedious errand he wanted to complete quickly. "Mom, let's be realistic," he said with an exaggerated sigh. "This will all be mine eventually, anyway. I'm your only son, the natural heir. We're simply accelerating the process to make everyone more comfortable. Are you certain about that?" I asked, and for the first time in months, My voice rang with firm clarity, loaded with an authority I'd forgotten I possessed. "Of course he is," Sarah interrupted, moving closer with her venomous smile. "David will inherit this house eventually, so we might as well start organizing things now. Besides, ma'am, at your age, you should be considering a move to somewhere more appropriate for someone in your condition." That night, while they ate dinner at my table using dishes I'd bought with my own hands, while they laughed and conversed as if I didn't exist, I remained in my room feeling every fiber of my being slowly transform. What I felt wasn't simply sadness or even anger. It was something far deeper and more dangerous. The absolute clarity of someone finally seeing truth after years of refusing to accept it. My name is Olivia. I'm 71 years old, and I've just discovered that the two people I trusted most in this world have been viewing me as an obstacle to be removed. For 50 years, I dedicated my body and soul to building a home, to raising children with values, to sacrificing every dollar, every dream, every personal desire so they could have everything I never had. I sold my wedding jewelry to finance David's college education. I mortgaged his house to fund his first business venture, which failed spectacularly. I worked double shifts cleaning other people's homes so he could have the church wedding he'd always dreamed of. And now, after all that sacrifice, they were demanding I ask permission to enter my own home. But what David and Sarah didn't know that night, what they never bothered to discover while plotting my humiliation with such callousness, is that a woman my age doesn't reach this point in life by being naive. I survived my husband's death. I raised 3 children alone. I built a life from nothing and navigated half a century of hardships without ever surrendering. And when a woman like me, with my experience and determination, decides to fight back, she becomes more lethal than any enemy they've ever faced in their comfortable, privileged lives. They had no idea that in less than a week, they would discover who truly owned this house, who held the real power. And by then, it would be far too late to beg forgiveness or attempt to repair the damage they caused. The war had just begun, but they didn't know it yet. That morning, sleep eluded me completely. I lay awake in my bed, the same bed where I'd given birth to David 45 years ago, back when midwives still made house calls and births happened between hand-embroidered sheets. I remembered crying with joy when I held him for the first time, that perfect baby who weighed barely 7 pounds, but already owned my heart completely. How far that night seemed from imagining that 4 decades later, that same child I'd sung lullabies to would be demanding I ask permission to enter my own house. The pain in my chest wasn't physical. It was something far deeper, as if a piece of my soul had been torn out without anesthesia. I rose slowly and walked to the dresser, where I kept my most treasured photographs. There was David at 5 in his kindergarten uniform that I'd ironed every morning for 2 years. David at 12, beaming with pride over his first math award. David at 18, the day he received his college acceptance letter. I picked up one photograph with trembling hands, his college graduation day. I stood beside him, radiant with pride, wearing the only elegant dress I owned, the same one I'd worn to my wedding 20 years earlier because I couldn't afford a new one. I'd worked double shifts for 4 years to pay for that degree, cleaning offices late into the night, coming home with chapped hands and an aching back. But it had been worth it, or so I thought then. Every dollar spent, every hour of sleep lost, every sacrifice made, it all made sense because I was building my son's future. My David was going to be a professional. He was going to have a better life than mine. He was going to remember his mother with fondness and gratitude. How naive I'd been. I remembered when Mark, my husband, fell ill with cancer. David was 25 then, already a grown man with a stable job at a construction company. But when his father began chemotherapy, when we desperately needed money for expensive medications, when the nights became a hell of pain and hopelessness, David always had an excuse not to be there. "Mom, I'm swamped with work," he'd say over the phone. "Mom, Sarah isn't feeling well and I need to care for her. Mom, you know I'm not good with these hospital situations." It was I who stayed awake night after night caring for Mark. I who sold my meager savings to buy medications. I who held him in my arms when he took his final breath one cold March morning. While David was away on a business trip he couldn't cancel. After the funeral, when the house filled with silence and loneliness, David would occasionally show up for dinner. Sarah accompanied him sometimes, but always with that forced smile I now recognized as pure artifice. They'd talk about their financial problems, how their apartment rent had increased, how expenses were suffocating them. Mom, David had said to me one afternoon exactly 6 months ago, "What would you think if we moved in with you for a while? Just until our financial situation improves. Besides, you'd feel less lonely, and we could help with the household expenses." How foolish I'd been to believe they actually wanted to help me. How blind not to see that from day one. Sarah had been surveying every corner of my house with calculating eyes, determining what would stay and what would disappear when I was gone. The first few months had been relatively peaceful. They paid some bills. That much was true, but I continued cooking, cleaning, and washing their clothes as if I were their maid. Sarah developed a habit of scattering her belongings throughout the house, marking her territory. Her creams on my vanity, her magazines on my coffee table, her clothes in my washing machine at all hours. But what wounded me most was watching David change. The affectionate boy who'd hug me goodnight had transformed into a stranger who barely acknowledged me. When I tried discussing memories, his childhood, his father, he responded in monosyllables while staring at his phone. "Yes, Mom." "No, Mom." "We'll talk later, Mom." But later never came, and Sarah, my dear daughter-in-law, had begun making increasingly pointed comments. "Olivia, don't you think this house is too large for one person?" "Olivia, my grandmother moved into a nursing home and she's thriving. She has company all the time. Olivia, at your age, you should be thinking about simplifying your life." Now, sitting on my bed at 3 a.m, I understood that all those comments hadn't been casual. They'd been part of a carefully orchestrated plan to make me feel like a burden, like someone in the way in her own home. I rose and walked to the window. The street lay silent, illuminated only by a flickering streetlight. Out there was the same neighborhood where I'd raised my children, where I'd built my life with Mark, where every neighbor knew and respected me. But inside this house, I'd been transformed into a stranger. I thought about my other 2 children, Laura and Daniel, living in other cities. They called occasionally, sent money on my birthday, visited at Christmas. But David had always been my favorite, my baby, my greatest pride. And now that same son was evicting me from my own home with the coldness of someone discarding obsolete furniture. The pain in my chest intensified, but was no longer purely sadness. It was something more dangerous, something growing steadily inside me like a seed planted in fertile soil. It was a realization that I had dedicated my entire life to raising a stranger, to sacrificing myself for someone who viewed me as an obstacle to his happiness. But it was also something else, something I hadn't felt in years. It was fury, a quiet, controlled, intelligent fury. The fury of a woman finally awakening from a dream that had lasted far too long. David and Sarah thought they knew Olivia, the submissive widow, the self-sacrificing mother, the elderly woman who settled for whatever crumbs of affection they'd toss her way. But they were mistaken. They'd only seen one facet of me, the part I'd chosen to show them for years because I loved them. They didn't know the Olivia who'd built a life from nothing. They didn't know the woman who'd navigated decades of adversity without ever surrendering. They didn't know the widow who'd learned to be strong because she had no alternative. And they certainly didn't know the mother who, when betrayed by the son she'd given everything to, could become the most dangerous enemy they'd ever faced in their comfortable, privileged lives. As dawn began filtering through my window, I made a decision that would change everything forever. I would no longer be the victim of this story. It was time to remind everyone who Olivia truly was. The next morning, David entered my room carrying a tray with coffee and toast, wearing a smile I hadn't seen in years. For a fleeting moment, my heart quickened, hoping he reflected on the previous night's events. Perhaps my son had returned. "Good morning, Mom," he said in that sweet voice he'd used as a child when he'd done something mischievous. "I brought you breakfast in bed. I thought we could talk peacefully, just you and me like before." I sat up slowly, observing every detail of his behavior. His eyes avoided mine for more than a second at a time. His hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he placed a tray across my lap. And that smile, That smile I knew so intimately was the same one he'd worn when asking me for money during his teenage years. "Thank you, son," I said, keeping my voice calm though something inside screamed warnings. "That's very thoughtful of you." David sat on the edge of my bed in the exact spot where he'd sit when plagued by nightmares, seeking comfort in my arms. But now his presence felt different, calculated, as if every gesture had been rehearsed before a mirror. "Mom, about last night," he began, running his hand through his hair, as he always did when nervous. "I think Sarah and I were a bit harsh with you. We didn't mean to hurt you." I took a sip of coffee. It was perfect, exactly how I liked it, with 1 teaspoon of sugar and a splash of milk. David remembered these details, which made everything more painful. "You didn't mean to hurt me," I repeated slowly, savoring each word. "Then what exactly did you mean, David?" He shifted uncomfortably, and I noticed his forehead beginning to glisten with perspiration despite the cool morning. "You see, Mom, Sarah and I have been thinking extensively about your future, your well-being. You're 71 now, and managing such a large house, the bills, the expenses, all of that must be tremendously stressful for you." There it was. I could see where this conversation was heading, like a train slowly approaching on visible tracks. But I decided to let him continue, to see how far he'd push his performance. "Go on," I said, cutting a piece of toast with the same precision I'd used to cut thousands of breakfasts for him throughout his childhood. "Well, we've been researching, and there are some very nice facilities, very modern, specialized for people your age. Places where you'd have constant companionship, where you wouldn't need to worry about anything, where you could participate in activities with people from your generation." My hand stopped midway in my mouth. "Facilities specialized for people my age." "Yes, Mom. Really elegant retirement communities with beautiful gardens, with specialized nurses, with—" "Nursing homes," I interrupted, my voice colder than intended. David flushed crimson, just as he had as a child when I caught him in a lie. "No, Mom, they're not nursing homes. They're more like residential complexes for seniors. Very different from what you're thinking." I placed the coffee cup back on the tray carefully, trying to control the trembling in my hands. What I felt wasn't fear. It was an explosive mixture of disappointment and rage growing in my stomach like a slow-burning fire. "And I suppose you've already found the perfect place for me," I said, looking him directly in the eyes for the first time in the conversation. "Well, yes, actually," he stammered. "There's one on the city outskirts that's beautiful. It is quite a long waiting list. But Sarah knows someone who works there who could help us secure you a spot." "How convenient," I murmured, feeling every piece of the puzzle beginning to fit together. "And when were you planning to inform me about this wonderful plan?" "Mom, it's not a plan," David said, rising from the bed and beginning to pace as he did when desperate. "It's a proposal for your own benefit. Think about it. No more worrying about bills, no more loneliness, no more responsibilities. You can relax, enjoy your final years in peace." "My final years," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of those words. "How thoughtful of you to consider my final years." "I didn't mean it like that," he hurried to clarify, but the damage was already done. His true intentions had surfaced like dirty water from a ruptured pipe. And what would happen to this house while I'm enjoying my final years in that lovely residence? David stopped abruptly, as if he'd walked into an invisible wall. His eyes darted frantically, searching for a convincing answer. "Well, Mom, the house can't remain empty. It would be wasteful and dangerous. Thieves always target abandoned houses." "Of course," I nodded slowly. "So you two would maintain it." "Exactly," he said, relief flooding his face as he assumed I was accepting his plan. "We'd stay here to keep it in good condition, so that whenever so it's always ready for whatever you need." The lie was so elaborate, so carefully constructed, I could almost admire the creativity behind it. But what hurt most wasn't the lie itself. It was the ease with which it flowed from my own son's mouth. "And the expenses for the residence?" I asked, feigning an innocence I was far from feeling. "Don't worry about that, Mom. I'll handle everything. We can use the savings you have in the bank, and if that's insufficient, we could consider mortgaging the house to cover the costs." There it was, the entire truth, naked and merciless as a slap across the face. They didn't just want to evict me from my house. They wanted me to finance my own banishment. They wanted me to pay for my own disappearance from their lives. Mortgage the house? I repeated, unable this time to disguise the venom in my voice. Only if necessary, Mom. And it would be temporary, just until I can better stabilize my income. I remained silent for several minutes, observing this 45-year-old man who'd emerged from my womb, whom I'd raised with all my love, to whom I'd taught the difference between right and wrong. Or so I believed. You know what, David? I said finally, with a smile that surprised even me with its calmness. You're absolutely right. At my age, managing all this is extremely complicated. His eyes lit up like a child's on Christmas morning. Really, Mom? You're considering the idea? I'm considering many things, I replied, taking another sip of coffee. Give me a few days to think it through. A decision this significant can't be made hastily. Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need. But remember, the sooner we act, the better options we'll have to secure you a truly excellent spot. When he left my room, I heard his hurried footsteps descending the stairs, then whispered voices in the living room. David and Sarah were celebrating their premature victory, convinced the old fool had fallen into their perfect trap. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that they'd just made the gravest mistake of their lives. They'd mistaken my silence for weakness, my maternal love for stupidity, my age for incapability. For 71 years, I'd learned that the most dangerous enemies are those who underestimate their opponent. And David and Sarah had just underestimated me in the most spectacular fashion possible. The next 3 days unfolded like a perfectly choreographed play where we all performed our roles with dedication. David and Sarah acted as loving children concerned for my well-being, while I played a confused elderly woman seriously considering their generous proposal. How did you sleep, Mom? David would ask each morning with a smile I now recognized as completely counterfeit. Have you thought more about what we discussed? I'm still reflecting, son. I'd reply while inside, every fiber of my being prepared for what was coming. It's an enormous decision at my age. Sarah had intensified her campaign of venomous comments disguised as maternal concern. Olivia, I noticed you struggling to open the jam jar yesterday. At your age, those simple tasks become very challenging. Olivia, don't you feel lonely in this enormous house when we're at work? Olivia, my aunt was in a residence and said it was like living in a 5-star hotel. But what they failed to notice was that I had begun my own silent investigation. While they assumed I was spending my afternoons watching television or napping, I was occupied with far more important tasks. On the second day, when they went out for lunch together, I seized the opportunity to carefully review all the papers David kept in his briefcase. Finding what I sought wasn't difficult. My son had never been careful with important documents, a flaw I'd tried correcting during his childhood without much success. Between overdue bills and bank statements, I discovered something that chilled my blood. A colorful brochure for the retirement community they'd so generously recommended. But it wasn't just any brochure. It contained notes in the margins in Sarah's handwriting, price calculations, dates circled in red. Basic package, $3,500 monthly. Premium package, $5,200 monthly. Initial deposit, $15,000. And below, in my daughter-in-law's clear handwriting, with house mortgage, this covers 8 to 10 years easy. 8 to 10 years. They'd calculated how long they expected me to live, as if I were an investment with an expiration date. They'd planned my death with the same coldness one plans a vacation. But what struck me hardest was a loose sheet with a real estate agency's letterhead. It was an unofficial appraisal of my house. $450,000 estimated quick sale price in current market. At the bottom, someone had handwritten, enough for down payment on luxury condo downtown plus residence expenses for several years. Everything was planned to the last detail. They didn't simply want to evict me from my house. They'd already decided where they'd live with my estate's proceeds. They'd even selected the neighborhood, the city's most exclusive area where the truly wealthy resided. I photographed every document with the smartphone Laura had given me last year, the phone David and Sarah believed I barely knew how to use. How mistaken they were. At 71, I'd learned that adaptation was a matter of survival, not age. On the third day, I did something I hadn't done in months. I left the house without informing them where I was going. When David inquired, I simply told him I needed to take a walk to clear my head about his proposal. I walked to the neighborhood where I'd lived for 30 years, greeting neighbors who'd known me since David was a child. Mrs. Carmen, who sold fruit on the corner, asked how my son was doing. Very well, I replied, taking good care of me. I passed Mrs. Helen's house, my lifelong neighbor, who was watering her front yard plants. We began chatting about trivial matters, but I had a specific purpose for this conversation. Tell me, Helen, what would you do if your children suggested you move to a nursing home? She fell silent for a moment, the hose still in her hand. Oh, Olivia, why do you ask? Don't tell me David. No, I hurried to clarify. It's merely a hypothetical question. A friend of mine is in that situation and asked for my advice. Helen dropped the hose on the ground and approached the fence separating our houses. Look, Olivia, I have 3 children, and none would dare suggest something like that. But if they did, I'd remind them that you don't raise children just so they can abandon you when you're no longer useful. Her words pierced my chest like pins. And if they insisted, she continued, I'd show them who truly holds a power in this relationship. Children sometimes forget that everything they have, they owe to their parents. A good reminder never hurts. That afternoon when I returned home, David and Sarah were waiting in the living room with expressions of concern that would have won an Oscar for Best Acting. Mom, where were you? David asked, jumping up from the sofa as if he'd been desperate. We looked everywhere for you. I went for a walk, I replied simply, to think about your proposal. And what did you decide? Sarah asked, and I could see genuine anxiety in her eyes. Not concern for my well-being, but anxiety to know if their plan would succeed. I've decided you're right, I said, and I watched them exchange a triumphant glance they tried to conceal. This house is too large for me, and you're too young to be burdened with caring for an elderly woman like me. You're not a burden, Mom, David lied, approaching to embrace me in what felt like a serpent's coil. Of course I am, I insisted, watching them exchange another look. This time with satisfaction they couldn't completely hide. But before making any final decisions, I need to settle some pending matters. Bank documents, legal papers, the sort of things you postpone until they become problems. Of course, Mom, Sarah said in a honey-sweet voice that now nauseated me. Take all the time you need. In fact, David and I can help with those errands if you'd like. No, I replied quickly. They're very personal matters, very tedious for you. Besides, I need to handle them myself for my own peace of mind. That night, while they quietly celebrated their victory in the kitchen, I remained in my room, making plans neither could imagine. They'd made the mistake of underestimating a woman who'd survived 71 years of life, 30 years of marriage, 20 years of widowhood, and decades of hard work. But above all, they'd underestimated the power of a betrayed mother who'd finally decided it was time to fight back. The next day, the real war would begin, and they wouldn't even know it had started until it was too late to surrender. On Friday morning, I left the house telling David I was going to the bank to review some documents. I wasn't lying completely, but I wasn't telling them the entire truth either. I had a critically important appointment I'd been postponing for years, an appointment that would change everything forever. The law firm of Glass & Associates was located downtown in a 3-story building I'd watched being constructed when I was young. I climbed the stairs slowly, not because of my age, but because each step brought me closer to a decision from which there was no return. Mrs. Mendez, the secretary, greeted me with a professional smile. Mr. Glass is expecting you. Daniel Glass had been David's college classmate, but he'd also been something more significant. He'd been the neighborhood boy I'd fed for 2 years when his mother worked double shifts at the textile factory. Many afternoons he'd come to my house hungry with no money for dinner, and I'd never closed my door to him. Olivia, he said, rising from his desk with that warm smile that had characterized him since childhood. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to see you. I haven't heard from you in years. Daniel, my boy, I replied, feeling for the first time in days that someone was looking at me with genuine affection. You look magnificent. Your mother would be so proud seeing you as a professional. We embraced like the family we'd been during his difficult childhood. He'd grown up without a father, with a mother who worked day and night to support him, and many times my home had been his refuge when the world became too harsh for an 8-year-old boy. Tell me, Olivia, how can I help you? He asked as we sat in his elegant office surrounded by law books and framed diplomas. Daniel, I need your help with something very delicate. I began, choosing my words carefully. But first, I need to tell you what's happening. For the next hour, I told him everything. I showed him the photographs of documents I'd found in David's briefcase. I described the conversations, explained the plan they designed to eliminate me. Daniel listened in silence, but I watched his expression harden with every detail. I can't believe it, he murmured when I finished my account. David was my friend. We studied together, shared so much. And you, Olivia, you were like a second mother to me. Children aren't always what we hope they'll be, I said with sadness I'd learned to carry like a stone in my chest. But now I need your professional help, not your personal sympathy. Daniel straightened in his chair, transforming from childhood friend to specialized attorney. Tell me exactly what you need. I need to protect my assets, I said with clarity that surprised me, and I need to do it in a way they cannot stop, change, or contest. Are you thinking about a will? I'm thinking of something more immediate, I replied, pulling a folder from my bag that I prepared during the night. I want to sell my house. Daniel was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of my decision. Olivia, selling a house is an enormous decision. Are you certain this is what you want? Completely certain, I replied without hesitation. But I need to do it quickly, before they suspect anything. And what do you plan to do afterward? Afterward, I'm going to disappear from their lives forever, I said. And for the first time in weeks, I felt truly at peace. I'm going to purchase a small apartment in another part of the city, live my final years as I choose, and make it abundantly clear to them that their plan failed. Daniel took notes in his legal pad, asking technical questions about property documentation, my debts, the legal aspect of the sale. It was evident he'd inherited his mother's intelligence and cultivated it through years of study. I have a contact at a very reliable real estate agency, he said after reviewing all the papers. They can conduct a professional appraisal on Monday and have a serious offer within a week. The market is extremely favorable for sellers right now. Perfect, I replied. And regarding legal aspects, can David prevent the sale in any way? No, Daniel assured me after reviewing the deeds. If you're the sole registered owner, he cannot. And according to these documents, you are indeed the exclusive owner. David has no legal claim to the property until you pass away, and only if you will designate him. Speaking of the will, I began, but Daniel interrupted with a smile I recognized from his mischievous childhood. Let me guess, you want to make some modifications there as well. Some modifications, I confirmed, returning his smile for the first time in days. We spent the next 2 hours designing a legal strategy that was perfect in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. Daniel knew all the technical aspects, but I knew David and Sarah better than anyone. Together, we created a plan neither could stop, one set in motion. Olivia, Daniel said when we finished, are you absolutely certain you want to proceed? Once we begin, there's no turning back. Daniel, my boy, I replied, feeling stronger than I had felt in years. They already made a decision about me. Now it's my turn to make decisions about them. And doesn't it sadden you? At the end of the day, David is still your son. I thought about his question for several minutes. It was fair, one that deserved an honest answer. It saddens me deeply, I finally admitted, but I cannot continue being a victim of someone who claims to love me while planning to eliminate me. At my age, I don't have time to keep waiting for David to become the son I hoped he'd be. When I left Daniel's office that afternoon, I walked through downtown streets feeling transformed. I was no longer the confused victim who'd entered the building 3 hours earlier. I was a woman with a plan, with allies, with the power to change her own story. That evening when I arrived home, David and Sarah greeted me with those artificial smiles I knew so well. "How did it go at the bank, Mom?" David asked with that performed concern he perfected over recent days. "Very well, son," I replied with complete calm. "Very, very well." What they didn't know was that in less than 72 hours, their comfortable lives and perfect plans were going to collapse like a house of cards in a storm. And by the time they realized what had happened, I would be far beyond their reach. The war had officially begun, but they still believed they were winning. On Monday morning, I feigned a headache to remain in bed while David and Sarah left for work. As soon as I heard their car engine fade into the distance, I rose with an energy I hadn't felt in months. I had exactly 8 hours to execute the first phase of my plan. At 9 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. It was Monica, the real estate agent Daniel had recommended, a woman in her 50s, elegant yet professional, who inspired immediate confidence. "Mrs. Mendez, what a pleasure to meet you," she said with a genuine smile. "Daniel briefed me somewhat about your situation. Let me assure you, we'll handle everything with the utmost discretion.